And with the tensions between Canada and the U.S. at what feels like an all-time high, I'm now joined in studio by Brendan Caldwell, director at Caldwell Securities Limited, for an update on the trade war and its impact. Brendan, thanks for joining us today.
Well, it's really nice to be here in person.
Now, I want to start with taking a step back from the trade war, because that's all anyone seemed to want to talk about.
Yes.
So let's talk about the specifics. What is a trade surplus and how does that work?
Well, a trade surplus is if you're exporting more of your goods to other countries than they're importing. So Canada has a trade surplus with the U.S. Most of that is energy, where our relatively cheap energy, oil sands and Quebec hydro, goes down to the United States. So we power the United States. Now, to the extent the U.S. has a trade deficit, the opposite, with other countries, including Canada, that's not necessarily a bad thing, because they are getting material goods in, and in exchange, they're just giving out paper. They're giving out American dollars. So they, because they are the world's reserve currency, are able to get real stuff in exchange for something they just print. So a trade surplus can be a good thing, but a trade deficit's not necessarily a bad one.
Now, there has been a debate on how much a tariff is passed on to the consumer. Does it depend on the product, or is it always kind of the same rate?
It really depends on how elastic there and how big a margin there is. So if you're on a very tight margin product, and food is very much in this category, and this is really relevant. I mean, my little church has got 500 families lined up every week out of our to access our food bank, which is not something we even saw in the Great Depression, and that's before all this. So something like food, where the margins are fairly narrow, quite a lot of it gets passed on. I don't know, computers and other maybe high-tech things have a little bit more margin to work with. Some other goods, steel, aluminum, well, they trade at the world price. So quite a lot ends up getting passed along, and eventually all of it gets passed along. It's just a question of when.
Now, you recently had a full-page ad in both the Globe and Mail and the National Post for Prime Minister Carney. How would you personally deal with the tariffs if you were asked by the Prime Minister?
Well, first off, I think the ad was mostly about the approach that we're taking right now, which is a tit-for-tat kind of thing, which I think what the President of the United States is anticipating, that he's going to put tariffs on and we're going to attack with tariffs and it's going to escalate. We've seen this act before, and it doesn't end well for anybody. There is no winners in a trade war. I think the president doesn't have a great deal of, well, let me find a nicer way to phrase it. The president has a lot of issues on his desk, and he will gravitate to the one that gets him the most media attention. And if picking a fight with Canada is that, then great for the moment. But he's got other things, bigger things to worry about: the Israel war, the Ukraine war. I think Mexico has had a little bit more success by taking a more patient approach, a more reasoned approach. If you're going to just go elbows up, which when it comes to raising awareness of the fact that we've done a perfectly good trade deal with Mr. Trump in his first presidency. I think he described it as the best trade deal in the history of the world, possibly ever, words to that effect. I do think that we do not need to. The problem is right now, Canada's in the middle of 2 election cycles. We just had the Ontario elections, and now we're apparently about to go into a federal election. So politicians want to be seen as doing something. I don't think that necessarily doing the very same thing that Trump expects is the right way to do it. I think raising an awareness that we are a free trading nation and creating both within Canada a much more free trade welcoming zone, because there's a lot of interprovincial trade barriers, and then doubling down on trade globally. I think that's a better approach than just picking a fight with America. Sticking to what we believe in, which is free trade, which is dragged hundreds of millions of people out of poverty over the last number of years. So that's where I'd go.
Now, you did just touch on the federal election, and I want to ask, do you think that an election happening right now is a good idea to counter these tariffs, or to work best with the trade war that's happening?
I do think an election right now is the best thing for our country. Answering the question more broadly than you asked it.
Right.
I think we've been now quite some months without Parliament being in session. I do believe in democracy. I don't believe in the Prime Minister being able to do whatever he wishes. I do think the Prime Minister should be answerable to Parliament. And we have not had a Prime Minister answerable to Parliament for quite some months now. And even still, because our current Prime Minister is not elected, he is not answerable to Parliament. So yes, I do think there should be election quite presently. I think that will happen, but I wouldn't be surprised if they take some other course because of this emergency that they need to postpone an election. We've had elections during world wars, real wars. I do think we should have an election and have a government that is actually answerable to the people now.
Now, I want to talk about Trump's annexation remarks. So a lot of people are claiming that this trade war is happening because he's trying to expose Canada and make them a bit weaker so that when he chooses to make annexation happen, it seems a little more open to, more Canadians are open to that being a possibility. Do you see Canada becoming a 51st state if Trump continues to push these tariffs in this trade war?
Well, I tell my American friends that they'll have no problem being the 11th province. We'll even teach them how to spell the word honor. So no, we're not going to be the math doesn't work. They don't want to pick up 40 million Democrats, which is more or less what we would be. So I don't think they're going to annex Canada, though I do think things like threatening to cut off the power to the United States is probably the surest way I can think of to get U.S. Marines at the Darlington nuclear plant to secure America's energy supply. So no, I don't think it's going to happen. I don't think that's a realistic outcome. I do think, though, that Mr. Trump does like to push on people's weaknesses. But if you think about how he does that, he also seems to be able to, I don't know that he necessarily means all that he says. I mean, Marco Rubio is one of his allies at this point. While they were campaigning against each other, he was Little Rubio or Little Marco. He's just, he has this way of belittling people. And if your go-to is to overreact to that, which is what he's counting on, then he'll just double down on it. It's no different than the schoolyard bully. If he sees that it bugs you, he's going to go after you even harder.
Now, with the luck of the Irish on your side, I'd like to ask you about the volatility in markets. Is this an investment opportunity?
Well, I think any time is an investment opportunity, good times and bad times. And as you pointed out to me off air, my wardrobe is sorely lacking for St. Patrick's Day. So happy St. Patrick's Day to you. Yes, I do think that volatility is a good time to begin to invest. If somebody has X dollars, if they had $100,000 they wanted to invest, there is no harm in starting with 10,000. Because the thing is, if you don't actually do anything to start with, it's very hard to pick a moment because either market keeps getting worse or it keeps getting better. If it keeps getting worse and you haven't done anything, you'll keep waiting and waiting and waiting. If it gets better, you'll wait till it comes back to where it was. So I think if you start with a little bit, the second decision becomes easier.
Well, Brendan, thank you so much for the time today.
Thank you, Theresa.